The wind does not ask for permission. In the high desert, it simply takes. It strips the moisture from the sagebrush. It wears down the red rock. And sometimes, if the winter is cruel enough, it tries to blow out the fragile flame of a human life. Koda knew this wind. He knew the land. He was a man who had delivered more babies than he could count. He had welcomed life into the world in summer heat so thick it felt like wool. And in winters so cold, the stars looked like they might crack like glass in the sky. He was a healer. He worked with his hands, with herbs, and with a quiet authority that his people trusted without question. But on this night, the wind was not listening to Koda. And for the first time in his life, his hands, those steady, capable hands, were not enough. The silence in the cabin was heavy. It wasn't the peaceful silence of sleep. His wife lay on the pallet, the sweat cooling on her skin. The struggle finished. The blood had darkened the blankets beneath her, spreading no matter what he tried, no matter how many times he pressed the folded cloths against her. She had looked at him at the very end, not with fear, but with a tired question: is he breathing? And Koda had told her, yes, he is strong. He held that strength in his arms now. A boy, little hawk. He had come into the world with a sharp, furious cry, slick and red and alive, for one terrible, beautiful heartbeat. Koda had allowed himself to hope that the price of this life wouldn't be so high. But the balance of the desert is strict. The mother's hand had slipped from his wrist, and the life left her as quietly as the sun slipping behind the mountains. So, Koda sat alone. The women had come and gone, washing the body, wrapping her carefully before the sun reached its highest point. The men had dug the grave near the cottonwoods where the earth was softest. They had left him with respectful footsteps and low voices, leaving him to a dwelling that suddenly felt too large, carrying a child who did not understand death, only hunger. At first, the hunger was a loud thing. The crying came in waves, sharp, urgent screams that faded into breathless whimpers before rising again. Koda walked the packed earth floor, back and forth. He murmured the nonsense words he had heard his wife use 1,000 times, trying to mimic the rhythm of a mother. But a father's chest is not a mother's breast. The baby rooted against Koda's shirt, his tiny mouth opening and closing, searching for something that was gone forever. Oh, Koda whispered into the dark. Oh, he was a man of science and earth. He did not panic. He worked. He warmed goat's milk over the fire, diluting it with water just as he had been taught, careful not to burn it. He dipped a clean cloth into the bowl and pressed it gently to his son's lips. The baby gagged, his small face scrunched in pain, and he let out a scream so raw, Koda nearly dropped him. Koda tried again and again. Milk thinner, milk warmer, milk cooler. He mashed cooked corn into water until it was a thin gruel and strained it through cloth. He counted the breaths. He waited, but nothing stayed down. The baby retched, the milk spilling down his chin, his little body going stiff with cramps. By nightfall, the truth settled over Koda like dust after a long ride. A newborn's stomach is a fragile vessel. It was not made for substitutes. It was not made for grain or the milk of goats. It was made for one thing only. He needed his mother, and she was in the ground near the cottonwoods. The second day passed into the third. The crying changed. It wasn't angry anymore. It was thin, desperate. Then, terrifyingly quiet. The baby cried without sound, his mouth open, his chest heaving. But with no breath left to give voice to his need, Koda looked at his son's face, the bones seeming sharper now, the skin too loose. He felt a tearing sensation inside his own chest. He had asked the women of his band, but those who had milk had lost their own babies to the hard winter, and their bodies had dried up with their grief. There was only one road left, a road he did not want to travel. Koda saddled his horse. He wrapped his son tight against his chest in his mother's blanket and rode toward the white settlement. He did not ride with ceremony. He rode with the singular focus of a dying man. The settlement was an ugly scar on the land, a cluster of wooden buildings and canvas roofs that had grown too fast. Without grace. Smoke rose from the chimneys. Dogs barked. Koda stopped at the first house. A woman opened the door. She took one look at his dark skin, his braided hair, and tried to close it. Koda put his hand out. He didn't touch her. He just blocked the wood. "My child needs milk," he said. His voice was steady, though his heart was hammering against his ribs. "He will die without it." The woman looked at the bundle. The baby let out a thin, desperate cry. She swallowed, but her eyes were hard. "I can't," she said. Then, "The truth, I won't." "Why?" Koda asked. "Because that's bad luck." She spat. "And because he's—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The door shut. He went to the second house. The woman there crossed herself as soon as she saw him. "No," she said sharply. "Absolutely not. That thing is cursed." He went to the third house. A man answered. He looked at Koda, then at the child, and laughed a short, ugly sound. "Not my problem," he said. "Should have thought of that." "Boy." Koda turned his horse back toward the open land. Behind him, he heard voices by the water barrels. Two women, gossiping in low tones. "Did you hear about that girl?" one asked. "The one who ran just had her baby and tried to disappear. Crazy thing. You don't break a contract and expect mercy." The other replied. The words meant nothing to Koda then. They were just noise. The only sound that mattered was the fading whimper against his chest. That night, the fire in Koda's cabin burned low. He sat on the floor, his back against the wall, rocking. He was no longer trying to solve the problem. He was simply waiting for the end. The baby's lips were dry. His skin felt cooler than it should. Koda pressed his forehead to the child's soft hair. "I'm here," he whispered. "I'm here. I won't leave you." He whispered apologies into the dark to his wife, to his ancestors, to a God he no longer trusted. "I did not fail you," he said. The words, tasting bitter. "I did everything right." But the fire just popped in answer. Maybe this was the lesson, the cruelest one of all. That healing has limits. That life is not something you can bargain for, no matter how steady your hands are. Dawn was approaching. The gray light of morning began to bleed through the cracks in the walls. Koda's thoughts were thick and slow, like syrup in winter. He was exhausted, his spirit hollowed out. Then, a sound outside, urgent, strained. "Leo, Koda, wake up." He pushed himself to his feet, his joints stiff. He opened the door. An Apache elder stood there. Her gray-streaked hair was plastered to her face with river water. She was breathing hard, her arms wrapped around a figure smaller, limp, and unmistakably white. "I found her by the river." The elder gasped. She was caught in the reeds, nearly gone. Koda looked down. The woman in the elder's arms was pale beneath the dirt and wet hair. Her lips were blue. She was no heavier than a bundle of wet clothes, all bone and chill. "Help her," the elder said, her eyes softening as she looked past Koda to the silent bundle inside the cabin. "And maybe she'll help you." Koda didn't ask questions. He stepped aside. He laid the stranger near the fire. He stripped away the wet dress, replaced it with dry cloth, and rubbed her limbs briskly to bring the blood back to the surface. He fed the fire until it snapped and hissed. He crushed herbs, bitter and green, into a stone bowl. He was working on muscle memory. He didn't know if he was saving her, or if he was just going through the motions to keep from looking at his dying son. "Stay," he murmured to the unconscious woman. "Stay." She shivered. Her teeth chattered. Color crept back into her cheeks, faint as the dawn. And then it happened. Behind him, the baby cried. It wasn't a scream. It was a thin, exhausted sound, more air than noise. A sound that cut through Koda like a blade. But the effect on the woman was instantaneous. Her eyes were still closed. She was still lost in the heavy fog of near death. But her body heard what her mind could not. She turned her head. Her brow creased. "He's hungry," she whispered. Her voice was barely there, cracked and hoarse. Koda froze. He looked at her. "How do you know?" The woman's throat worked. Her hand moved instinctively to her chest, where the wet fabric of her shirt was suddenly staining dark. "Milk, because that sound never leaves you," she breathed, her eyes fluttering open. Unfocused, but fierce, even when you try to drown it. Koda looked at the milk leaking from her. He looked at his son, whose mouth was opening and closing, searching for a mother who wasn't there. And in that small, smoky room, as the wind howled outside, Koda realized the road hadn't ended. It had just turned. The fire had burned down to embers, casting long, trembling shadows against the walls of the cabin. In that small room, the air was thick with the scent of burning cedar and the sharp, metallic tang of fear. Sarah woke slowly. Her return to the world of the living was not gentle. It was a clawing, gasping ascent from deep water. Her first sensation was the ache in her bones, the kind of deep, shivering cold that river water leaves behind, even after the skin is dry. Her second sensation was sound. It was a sound that cut through the fog of her exhaustion like a knife. A cry. Thin, reedy, and desperate. She pushed herself up on her elbows. The room spun. The firelight blurred. But her eyes found him instantly, the man. The Apache healer, standing with his back to the wall, holding a bundle that was far too small and far too quiet. Koda saw her move. He froze. He saw the way her gaze locked onto the child. A look of such intense, terrifying recognition that he almost stepped back. "He's hungry," she said. Her voice was a ruin, scraped raw by the water in her lungs. But the certainty in it was absolute. Koda looked down at his son. The boy's mouth was opening and closing. A fish on dry land, searching for a salvation Koda could not provide. He looked back at the woman. She was a stranger. She was white. She had been dead an hour ago. And yet, she was looking at his son, not with the disgust he had found in the settlement, but with a fierce, burning need. "You are weak," Koda said, his voice rough. "You need rest." She ignored him. She swung her legs off the pallet, her bare feet hitting the packed earth floor. She swayed, nearly collapsing. But when Koda moved to steady her, She held up a hand. "Give him to me," she said. It was not a request. It was a command born of a biological imperative that superseded all caution. "You've been in the river," Koda argued. Though his grip on the child was loosening, "You have no strength." "I have this," she whispered, her hands trembling as she reached out. "I can hear it. That sound. It never leaves you." Koda hesitated for only a heartbeat. He was a man of logic, of earth and root. But he was also a father watching his son fade. He stepped forward and placed the child in her arms. The transfer was heavy, with unspoken weight. As Sarah took the weight of the baby, her trembling stopped. Her hands, pale and scarred, moved with a sudden, practiced grace. She adjusted his head, her fingers splaying across his back to support him. It was a muscle memory, a ghost movement from a life she had been forced to leave behind. She looked at Koda. Her eyes were gray-blue, sharp with pain and defiance. "Are you just going to stand there?" she asked. Koda blinked. The realization hit him, bringing a sudden heat to his face. He turned away instantly, his heart pounding a rhythm against his ribs that he hadn't felt since the birth. He walked to the far side of the room and gripped the edge of the rough-hewn table, his knuckles turning white. Behind him, there was the rustle of fabric, a pause, a breath held in the dark, and then the silence changed. It was no longer the terrifying silence of a dying child. It was a full silence, a heavy, warm silence. And within it, the sound that Koda had prayed for, the rhythmic, desperate sound of a child feeding, sucking, swallowing, living. Koda closed his eyes. His knees felt weak, his own breath shaking as it left his chest. The tension that had held his spine rigid for 4 days suddenly snapped, leaving him leaning heavily against the wood. He listened to the sound of his son drinking, and it was the sweetest music he had ever heard. Minutes passed. The rhythm in the room slowed. The frantic gulping turned into steady, contented pulls. He was starving. Sarah's voice came from the shadows. It wasn't accusatory. It was just a fact, heavy and sad. "I know," Koda replied, not turning around. "I tried. You couldn't have fixed this," she said softly. Some things aren't meant to be fixed alone." When Koda finally turned, the fire had settled into a low, steady glow. Sarah was sitting on a stool, her back curved protectively around the infant. The baby was milk-drunk, his small fists uncurled for the first time in days, his body limp and heavy with sleep against her skin. Sarah's face was wet. Tears streamed down her cheeks, silent and constant, washing away the river mud. She didn't wipe them away. She just watched the boy. Her expression, a shattering mix of love and a grief so profound it filled the room. "Do you have a child?" Koda asked. The question hung in the air. Her shoulders stiffened. She looked away, toward the dark window. "Yes," she said. "Where is he?" "Not here." She offered nothing more. And Koda, a man who understood that some wounds cannot be touched, did not press. He stepped forward and gently took his sleeping son from her arms. The baby didn't wake. He was full, safe, dreaming. Koda laid him in the basket. He looked at the woman who had just saved his world. "I'm Koda," he said. She hesitated, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Sarah, thank you." "Sarah, I didn't do it for you," she whispered, her eyes closing as exhaustion finally claimed her. "I know," Koda said, Sarah slept for 12 hours. She slept like the dead, motionless and heavy. Koda moved around the cabin like a ghost. He fed the fire. He crushed herbs. He checked her breath, watching the rise and fall of her chest, just as he had once watched his wife's. But this time, the chest kept moving. When she woke, the sun was high. Her first instinct was panic. Her eyes flying open. "The baby," she rasped. "He is sleeping," Koda said. From the corner, where he was mending a harness, he fed well. The relief that crossed her face was so raw it hurt to witness. She slumped back against the blankets, covering her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Koda let her weep. He knew that grief was a poison that had to be bled out. In the days that followed, a strange, quiet rhythm took hold of the cabin near the cottonwoods. They were two broken halves of different worlds. Koda, the Apache healer who had failed to heal the one person who mattered. Sarah, the white woman who had been cast out, carrying a milk supply for a ghost child. They did not speak much. Words felt dangerous, liable to break the fragile truce of their survival. But they moved around each other. Koda watched her. He saw how she moved with the baby practiced. Sure. Efficient. There was no hesitation in her hands. She knew how to hold the boy to comfort him, how to burp him against her shoulder, how to soothe him when he fussed. It was as if her body remembered motherhood, even while her mind tried to forget the pain of it. He respected her boundaries. When she needed to feed the child, he turned his back, or went outside to chop wood. When she sat by the fire, staring into the flames with that hollow, 1,000-yard stare, he brought her water and set it down silently, close enough to reach, but far enough not to intrude. One evening, as the desert cooled and the sky turned a bruised purple, they sat on the small porch. Sarah was rocking the basket with her foot. Koda was sharpening a knife. The rhythmic shh of the stone against steel. "The only sound. You went into the river," Koda said. It wasn't a question. "Really?" Sarah stopped rocking. She looked at her hands. They were rough, red from the cold water and the work. "I didn't mean to," she said quietly. "I didn't plan to end up here. You don't have to explain," Koda said. She let out a breath that was almost a laugh. A sharp, broken sound. Everyone always says that. Then they wait for the story. Koda stopped sharpening. He looked at her. Really looked at her. He saw the strength in her jaw, the sorrow in her posture. "I don't need the story," he said. "I don't need the story to let you stay." She looked up, startled. Her eyes searched his face for pity, for judgment. She found neither. "You're not afraid of me," she said. "A white woman, a stranger." "No," Koda replied simply. "You fed my son." That was the tether, the line that bound them. It wasn't romance. Not yet. It wasn't even friendship. It was a shared duty to the small, fragile life in the basket between them. Sarah stayed. At first, it was just for the baby. That was the unspoken understanding. Koda did not ask her to remain. She did not offer promises. But the baby needed milk. And she had it. The baby needed a mother. And she was one. The changes came slowly, like the turning of the season. Little Hawk grew. His skin, once gray and papery, turned golden and warm. His cries, once weak whimpers, became strong, demanding shouts. He slept for longer stretches. And because he slept, Koda slept. The sharp, manic edge of panic that had driven Koda for weeks began to dull. Sarah changed, too. The hollows in her cheeks began to fill. She started to cook simple meals. Corn and rabbit moving around the fire, with a familiarity that made the cabin feel less like a shelter and more like a home. One afternoon, Koda came back from the river to find her singing. It was a soft, broken melody, something from her own childhood, humming while she scrubbed clothes in the basin. She stopped when she saw him, embarrassed. But the sound hung in the air, softening the rough wooden walls. They began to fit together. Koda would bring in the firewood, and Sarah would have the pot boiling. Sarah would lift the baby, and Koda would already be there with a warm blanket. They moved around each other without collision, without hesitation, like two trees whose roots had tangled deep underground. It was intimate. In a way, it was more intimate than a marriage bed. They were keeping something alive together. One night, watching the baby nurse, Sarah touched the boy's cheek. He pulled away, milk-drunk and drowsy, his heavy eyelids fluttering. "He's going to be big," she murmured. Koda glanced over from the fire. "His mother was strong," he said. "Yes," Sarah said softly, looking down at the child who was drinking her life, growing strong on her sorrow. "I can see that." The word mother hung between them. It was a ghost word, belonging to the woman in the grave and the woman in the room. Koda didn't correct her. He didn't need to. He watched Sarah in the firelight. He saw the way she looked at the door sometimes, toward the settlement. He saw the fear that still lived in her shoulders. But he also saw the way she held his son fiercely, protectively, as if he were the anchor keeping her from drifting back into the river. They were two people who had lost everything. But in this small, quiet cabin, breathing in the scent of cedar and milk, they were beginning to realize something terrifying and wonderful. They were no longer alone. Truth is a strange thing. It can be buried under silence for a long time, like a seed waiting for rain. But eventually, the earth shifts. Eventually, the root breaks through. For weeks, the truth of Sarah's past had been a ghost in the cabin. It sat with them at the fire. It watched from the corners. While she nursed Koda's son, Koda knew it was there. He saw it in the way her hands would sometimes freeze while folding a blanket, or the way she would wake with a gasp, her arms reaching for a phantom weight that wasn't there. He never pressed her. He knew that a wounded animal bites if you reach too fast. But one evening, as the sun dipped below the mesa, painting the sky in bruises of purple and red, the silence finally broke. Sarah was standing on the porch, her eyes fixed on the distant line of trees that marked the edge of the white settlement. Her arms were wrapped tight around her chest, holding herself together. "He's not far from here," she said. Her voice was so quiet, Koda almost missed it. Koda looked up from where he was grinding corn. He didn't ask who. He knew. "I walk to the edge of the trees sometimes," she confessed, not turning to face him. "I don't go in. I just look. I tell myself if I can just see the roof of the house, I'll know he's still there." Koda set the stone pestle down. The sound was loud in the stillness. "Do they know?" he asked. "No," Sarah said. She shook her head. A sharp, jagged movement. "If they did, they'd chase me off. Or worse." She turned then, and the twilight caught the raw, naked pain in her face. It was the face of a woman who had been hollowed out. She began to speak, the words tumbling out like stones from a dam that had burst. She spoke of poverty without drama, She spoke of a winter where the food ran out and the work dried up. She spoke of the couple in the big house. They wanted a child. But the wife could not carry one. They wanted a womb. They wanted Sarah. I thought it would be simple, she whispered, her hands clenching white at her sides. I signed the paper. I took the money. Carry the child. Give birth. Walk away. She laughed then. A short, broken sound that had no humor in it. And then he kicked, she said. And then he moved when I sang. And he stopped being an idea. And he started being mine. Koda listened. He understood the connection of blood and bone. He understood that a contract made of paper cannot hold back the tide of love. When they took him, Sarah said, her voice trembling, my body didn't understand the paper. My milk came in for him. My arms ached for him. I went to the river not to die, but because the sound of the water was the only thing loud enough to drown out the crying in my head. Koda stood up. He crossed the distance between them, stopping just short of touching her. Grief is a heavy stone, he said softly, too heavy to carry alone. Sarah looked at him, tears cutting tracks through the dust on her face. I'm afraid, she whispered. Every day. I'm afraid. So am I, Koda admitted. That night, the ghost was no longer in the corner. It was between them, acknowledged and named. But naming a ghost doesn't make it leave. Sometimes, it just gives it form. The next morning, the air felt wrong. It was too quiet. Even the birds along the riverbank seemed to be holding their breath. Sarah told herself she would stop at the cottonwoods. That was the rule she had made to keep herself sane. Look once. Make sure the house was still standing. Turn back. Rules were the only thing keeping her upright. But when she reached the tree line, the pull was too strong. It was a physical tether, hooking behind her ribs and dragging her forward. She wrapped her shawl tighter, covering her hair, and stepped out of the safety of the trees. The settlement was busy. Wagons rattled, dogs barked. But Sarah moved like a shadow, invisible and watchful, a skill she had learned in the hard months before the birth. She reached the house. It was large, painted a stark, fresh white that tried too hard to look respectable against the dust of the frontier. The curtains were heavy velvet, drawn tight to keep the world out. Sarah crept to the back. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She found a gap in the curtains, just a sliver of glass. She pressed her face to the cool window. Her breath stopped. There was a crib in the center of the dim room, a wooden cradle, carved with expensive roses, and inside it lay her son, Julian. He was awake, and he was screaming. His face was a dark, congested red, twisted with the effort of his distress. His small fists beat uselessly against the heavy wool blanket. He was crying with a desperation that Sarah felt in her own marrow. Sarah waited. She waited for the door to open. She waited for the soothing murmur of a mother, the rush of footsteps, the lifting of arms. Minutes passed. 5, 10. No one came. The baby's cries began to thin, turning into those terrifying, breathless gasps that signal exhaustion. He was alone. Then, Sarah saw it. The baby thrashing had kicked off the blanket. On his upper arm, stark against the pale skin, were marks. Dark, violet bruises. They were too precise to be accidental. They were the shape of fingers, a grip, hard and impatient, that had squeezed too tight through the thin glass. A sound drifted out from the other room. Laughter, the clink of china, A man's voice. Sharp and dismissive. He's a means to an end. The voice said. That's all. The world tilted on its axis. The ground beneath Sarah's feet felt like it was dissolving. She stumbled back from the window. Her stomach turned cold. A nausea rising up. So violent, she thought she might be sick right there in the dirt. She didn't remember the run back. She didn't remember the thorns tearing at her skirt or the sun beating down on her neck. She only remembered the terror. She burst into the cabin, her chest heaving, her eyes wild. Koda was grinding herbs at the table. He looked up, and the bowl tipped over, scattering leaves across the floor. He had never seen her look like this, not even when she came out of the river. This wasn't grief. This was fury. What happened? He asked. Sarah couldn't speak at first. Her mouth opened, but no sound came. When the words finally tore loose, they were jagged and broken. They're hurting him, she gasped. They leave him alone. They don't come when he cries. Koda stepped closer. Sarah, and there were bruises. She choked out, the tears finally spilling over. Fingerprints. On his arm. Koda went still. The healer in him vanished. The warrior took his place. His jaw tightened. A hard line of muscle jumping in his cheek. Are you sure? He asked. Though he already knew. He could see the truth of it in the way she was shaking. Yes, Sarah cried. I was wrong. I was wrong to think I could just watch. I thought he would be safe. Because they wanted him. But they don't want a child. They want leverage. They want an heir to secure an estate. That's all he is to them. She grabbed Koda's arm, her fingers digging in. I'm not losing another one. I won't survive it. The silence that followed was thick with danger. Koda looked at her. He looked at the white woman who had saved his son's life with her own body. He looked at the fire where his own child slept, safe and fed because of her. He knew what she was asking, and he knew the cost. For an Apache man to ride into a white settlement and take a white child, it was not a rescue. In the eyes of the law, it was a kidnapping. It was an act of war. It was a death sentence written in ink and lead. Sarah saw the hesitation. Her face crumbled. They have money, she whispered. They have influence. The law listens to people like them. Koda placed a steady hand on her shoulder. His skin was warm against her cold trembling. The law listens to proof, he said, his voice low and dangerous. And it listens to witnesses. I signed papers. She wept. Papers assume harm will not come to a child. Koda replied. They broke the contract when they marked his skin. He turned and walked to the wall where his rifle hung. He took it down, checking the action with a fluid, practiced motion. We take him back, Koda said. Sarah stopped crying. She looked at him, and for the first time, she saw not just the gentle healer who ground corn, but the man who had survived the desert, the winters, and the loss of everything he loved. Tonight, she asked. Koda looked her in the eye. Tonight. Night did not fall gently that evening. It settled over the land like a heavy blanket, thick with intent. Koda did not ride alone. But he did not ride for war. He rode for something far more dangerous. He rode for truth. They moved through the darkness, with the silence of ghosts. Koda, Sarah, and the shadows of men who had owed Koda their lives in winters past. They approached the settlement, not with torches or war cries, but with the terrifying quiet of a storm about to break. The house stood at the edge of town, dark, except for a single lamp burning in a lower window. It looked peaceful, a portrait of civilized life. But Sarah knew the rot that lay beneath the fresh paint. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that threatened to drown out the night sounds. But her hands were steady. "Stay behind me," Koda whispered. He did not knock. There was no courtesy left for people who bruised children. Koda pushed the door open with a controlled force that sent it banging against the wall. The sound shattered the stillness. Inside, the man of the house scrambled to his feet, knocking over a chair. "What the hell?" he shouted. Squinting into the sudden intrusion, Sarah stepped into the light. She looked small in the doorway, her dress dusty, her hair windblown. But when she spoke, her voice rang with a clarity that cut through the room. "I'm taking my child," she said. The man's wife appeared from the hallway, clutching her robe. Her face hardened instantly when she saw the woman she had discarded. "You have no right," she snapped. "I have every right," Sarah cut in, her voice trembling, not with fear, but with fury. "You left him to cry until he lost his voice. You marked his skin. That's a lie." The woman spat, then explained the bruises. Koda said quietly, stepping fully into the lamplight. The air in the room shifted. The husband reached for the drawer of the heavy oak desk. His hand came up holding a pistol. The metal glinted in the lamplight. "You think you can just steal him?" the man demanded, the gun shaking slightly in his grip. "There are contracts. There are courts. He is property." Koda did not reach for his own weapon. He didn't have to. Because Sarah moved. She stepped directly in front of the barrel. She didn't scream. She didn't plead. She looked at the man with eyes that had seen the bottom of a river and survived. "A contract assumes care," she said, her voice icy calm. "You broke it when you bruised him." The man hesitated. The law listens to witnesses." Koda interrupted, and then the shadows in the doorway moved. The Apache elder stepped forward, her presence commanding the room without a single word. Behind her, two other men appeared, silent, imposing, violent as shadows. They were not there to attack. They were there to see. The wealthy couple shrank back. They realized, with a sudden, cold clarity, that their money could buy paper, but it could not buy silence. Not tonight. If they fired that gun, the whole territory would know why. They would know about the bruises. They would know about the neglect. The elder pointed a gnarled hand toward the cradle in the corner. "Bring the child," she said. The woman of the house hesitated, looking to her husband, but the gun had already lowered. The man looked at the grim faces of the witnesses, and he saw his own defeat. "Now," the elder commanded. Sarah crossed the room. She lifted her son from the wooden cradle. The baby let out a soft, startled whimper, his body tense. But then he smelled her. He smelled the scent of the mother who had carried him, the scent of the milk that had saved another. He calmed instantly. "See," Sarah whispered, pressing her face into his hair. "He knows." They left the house without another word. They left the contracts and the laws and the propriety behind them in the dust. They rode out of the settlement as the first gray light of dawn began to bleed into the sky, leaving the town to wake up to a world that had fundamentally changed. The journey home was quiet. The adrenaline faded, replaced by a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. But it was a good exhaustion, the kind that comes after a fever breaks. Sarah sat tall in the saddle, her arms full. On one side, she held Koda's son, little Hawk. On the other, she held Julian. Two boys, one dark, one fair, both fed, both safe. When they reached the cabin, the sun was fully up, painting the cottonwoods in strokes of gold. The air smelled of sage and damp earth. It smelled of home. They went inside. Koda built up the fire until it crackled and popped, chasing away the morning chill. Sarah sat on the floor. The two babies settled against her chest, feeding together, as if this had always been the plan. Koda watched them for a long moment. He felt a tightness in his chest loosen a knot he hadn't realized he'd been carrying since the night his wife died. He looked at Sarah, her head bowed over the children, and he knew that the time for temporary measures was over. He went outside and returned with a piece of pine wood. He sat by the fire, opposite her, and took out his knife. He began to carve. The strokes were slow and rhythmic. Shh, shh. He shaved the wood down, careful and deliberate. He was making a second cradle. He worked in silence, smoothing every edge, ensuring there were no splinters to catch on soft skin. Sarah watched him from across the fire. She didn't ask what he was doing. She didn't need to. When it was finished, hours later, Koda set the new cradle beside the first one. They stood side by side near the warmth of the hearth. There was no ceremony. There were no speeches. There was just the wood, the fire, and the two children sleeping soundly in the space between them. Koda looked at Sarah. "You don't have to stay," he said softly, giving her the door one last time. Sarah looked up at him. Her eyes were tired, but the fear was gone. In its place was something steady, something permanent. "I know," she said, "but I want to." Koda nodded. "So do I." Outside, the wind whispered through the leaves. But inside, the house was full. 2 lives saved, 2 futures claimed. And between the 2 cradles, a family had begun to take root, not by blood alone, but by the stubborn, terrifying refusal to let go of love. Time in the desert is not measured by clocks. It is measured by the height of the sagebrush, by the deepening lines on a man's face, and by the way a house grows to hold the life inside it. 5 winters had passed since the night of the raid. 5 springs had softened the memory of the storm. The cabin near the cottonwoods was no longer just a shelter against the wind. It was a home. Koda had expanded it, building another room with his own hands, shaving the pine wood down slow and careful. Beside the house, where the earth had once been packed hard and unforgiving, a garden now grew green, shoots of corn and squash pushing up through the dust. A testament to permanence. But the true harvest was running through the trees. 2 boys chased each other through the tall grass, their laughter echoing off the canyon walls. There was Sam Koda's blood, who had grown tall and stubborn, quick to laugh and quicker to argue. And there was Jules, Sarah's blood, who was quieter, thoughtful, his eyes always tracking movement. His small hand often curling tight around his mother's skirt. They were different boys, born of different sorrows, but they were brothers all the same. They shared a table, a fire, and a history that belonged only to them. One afternoon, the running stopped. The boys had collapsed in the shade of the great cottonwood tree. Jules, 5 years old, and full of questions that were too big for his mouth, looked at Koda working by the fence, and then looked down at his own pale arm next to Sam's dark one. He walked over to Sarah, who was kneeling in the garden. He watched her for a long time before he spoke. "Mama," he asked, his brow furrowed in that serious way of his. "Why don't I look like Papa? Sam looks like Papa." "I don't." Sarah sat back on her heels. She wiped her hands on her apron and looked at the boy who had been returned to her from a house of velvet and silence. Koda stopped his work by the fence. He didn't turn around, but his hammer went still. Sarah reached out and brushed the hair from Jules's forehead. She didn't look at Koda. She looked only at her son. Family isn't paint. Jules, she said softly. It isn't about matching colors. It's a quilt. We are different pieces, different fabrics, stitched together by the same thread. And that thread is stronger than anything else. Jules considered this. He looked at Sam, who was waving a stick like a sword. Then he looked at Koda. Koda turned then and offered the boy a small, quiet nod. Did you choose us? Jules asked. Yes, Sarah said without hesitation. Every day, Koda walked over, placing a heavy, warm hand on the boy's shoulder. So did I, he said. That was enough. Later that evening, as the sun began its long descent, burning the horizon into a brilliant line of fire, Koda and Sarah sat on the porch. The day's work was done. The boys were asleep inside, their breathing deep, and even the sound of children who know they are safe. They sat in the companionable silence that only comes after years of shared survival. Koda looked out over the land, then back at the woman who had once been a stranger brought in from the river. Half drowned and broken, he reached out and took her hand. His skin was rough against hers, weathered by the years, but his grip was gentle. Sarah squeezed back. She didn't pull away. She leaned into him, her shoulder resting against his. There was no need for a big speech. There was no need to retell the story of the milk, or the raid, or the nights they had spent terrified that the world would come to take what they had built. The story was written in the lines of their hands. They had made it. The world had thought they were broken things. It had thought a grieving Apache man and a cast-off white woman were finished. But broken things, when mended with gold and grit, are stronger at the cracks. As the sun finally slipped away, the wind came down from the hills, but it was no longer the hollow, lonely wind that had howled through the cracks on the night of the birth. It was warm. It rustled the leaves of the cottonwoods, and if you listened closely, it carried the echo of laughter. The land held them, and finally, after all this time, they held each other. And that, dear listeners, is where we leave Koda and Sarah, not at the end of their lives, but at the beginning of their peace. It's a reminder that sometimes the family we find is even stronger than the one we are born into. I'd love to know what you're thinking right now. Did Sarah's choice to go back for Jules surprise you? Or would you have done the exact same thing? Tell me your story in the comments below. I read every single one. And while you're there, let me know where you're listening from tonight. I love seeing our community stretch across the map. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like. It helps more people find these stories of the frontier. Share it with a friend who needs a reminder that it's never too late to start over. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a journey back in time. This is Echoes of the West. Until the next trail, stay safe.